Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving straight into a truly fascinating investigation today, looking at the secular, ancient evidence for the historical existence of Jesus. We'll be unpacking a deeply researched piece by author Mark Bates, and what's so cool about his approach is that he tackles this topic not from a theological starting point, but strictly as a historian.
So let's just start with the elephant in the room. Did Jesus of Nazareth actually exist? And if you spend, any time at all on the internet, you've probably stumbled across the Christ myth theory, this idea that Jesus never even lived and was just some mythical stitched-together composite. But what's really interesting is that among credentialed historians across the entire ideological spectrum, this mythicist view is considered a massive academic outlier. It's barely on their radar. So let's find out why.
When you actually apply the standard rules of historiography, the historian's perspective becomes crystal clear. The sheer volume of evidence for Jesus is staggering, especially when you compare it to other major classical figures. Take Alexander the Great, right? A guy with an absolutely massive historical footprint. Yet his earliest surviving biographies were written somewhere between 300 and 400 years after he died. Jesus, on the other hand, is cited by over 40 different sources within just 150 years of his death. To put that into perspective, if historians threw out the evidence for Jesus, they would basically have to throw out most of ancient history along with it.
So how exactly do we sift through all this? Well, the source relies on a methodology called critical realism. Think of it like acting as a historical detective. Critical realism just means we respect the historical data and evaluate ancient texts objectively. We don't bring in an absolute rigid bias against supernatural claims, but, and this is key, we also recognize the strict boundaries of what history, as an academic discipline, can actually prove. We're just looking for the verifiable facts on the ground.
All right, let's bring in our first set of witnesses. Section 1. The Imperial Dossier, Roman Evidence.
We are kicking things off with the elite Roman historians. And get this, these guys had absolutely zero theological sympathy for the early Christian movement. Like, they literally despised it, which actually makes their testimony incredibly valuable for us. Take a look at this quote from Publius Cornelius Tacitus, writing around 115 CE. He was an elite Roman senator, meaning he had direct access to official imperial archives. He wrote, "Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate." Remember, Tacitus openly called Christianity a mischievous superstition, so he is a completely hostile witness.
Okay, let's break down exactly what we can extract from just this single Roman source. Tacitus precisely locks down the who, the when, and the where of the execution. The founder was named Christus. He was executed during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. He was specifically condemned by Pontius Pilate. And the movement started in Judea before spreading all the way to Rome. I mean, that is a massive amount of historical bedrock from a guy who actively hated the movement.
Moving right along, next up is Pliny the Younger. He was a Roman governor writing an official administrative report to Emperor Trajan right around 112 CE. Pliny was actively interrogating Christians to figure out how to prosecute them in Asia Minor. He reports they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a god.
So what's the big takeaway from Pliny's interrogation? Well, within just a couple of generations of the crucifixion, you have an official Roman governor documenting the explosive, widespread growth of this group. They gathered on a fixed day, which we now know as Sunday. They swore strict ethical oaths not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery. And honestly, most strikingly, they were already offering high Christological worship to Jesus as a god. This proves their core practices didn't take centuries to evolve. They were established incredibly early on.
Okay, bringing it a bit closer to ground zero. Section 2. The Local Witness, Flavius Josephus.
Josephus is the most geographically and chronologically proximate non-Christian witness we have. He was a first-century Jewish historian born in Jerusalem. He did write about Jesus, but for centuries, historians argued over his text because later Christian scribes had clearly gone in and added their own theological edits to the Greek copies. But here's where it gets really fun. In 1972, scholars uncovered the Agapius manuscript. This was a 10th century Arabic version of Josephus's text, and it was completely free from those later Christian alterations. It gave us this pristine, unfiltered look at Josephus's original, neutral, historical observations. A total game changer.
And here is exactly what that uncorrupted Arabic text says. At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. Pilate condemned him to be crucified. Those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship.
They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion. Notice how remarkably neutral that tone is compared to what an overzealous Christian editor would have written.
So when we strip away all those scribal edits, the authentic core facts from Josephus line up perfectly with our Roman dossier. Josephus confirms Jesus was known as a wise, virtuous teacher. He attracted both Jewish and Gentile disciples. He was absolutely condemned to crucifixion by Pilate. And crucially, as a historical footnote, his disciples claimed post-mortem appearances. We've literally got two independent lines of secular history converging right here.
Which brings us to our third category of witnesses. Section 3. Hostile attestation. For this part, we're looking at sources from groups who actively oppose the early Christian movement. This relies on a super fascinating historiographical principle called enemy attestation. Basically, if your worst enemies admit to something you did while they're actively trying to drag your name through the mud, well, it almost certainly happened. They have absolutely no reason to invent a narrative that inadvertently helps your case, right?
A fantastic example of this is right in the Babylonian Talmud. It's a hostile rabbinic text clearly meant to counter early Christians. It reads, "On the eve of the Passover, Yeshu was hanged, because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy." Make no mistake, this is a highly polemical, very negative text.
But honestly, look at the sheer amount of unintentional historical validation here. It's incredible. The writers don't even try to deny Jesus existed. By accusing him of sorcery, they inadvertently validate that he had a massive public reputation for performing miracles. They just reframed those miracles as something dark. By saying he was hanged, they actually confirmed the crucifixion. And they even hit the nail on the head with the timing, the eve of Passover. Let's zoom out for a second and put all these pieces together on a timeline. The crucifixion happens around 30 to 33 CE. By 35 CE, we have the earliest oral creeds, which we're going to talk about in just a sec. By 49 CE, Suetonius records Christians causing a stir in Rome. By 93 CE, Josephus is writing his history, and between 112 and 117 CE, Pliny and Tacitus write their imperial accounts. All of this independent, secular evidence originates within a remarkably tight chronological window. It completely, utterly crushes the mythicist argument that Jesus was just some fictional invention made up centuries later.
All right, so we've firmly established this secular historical baseline. But it naturally begs the question, what does all this secular evidence actually mean for biblical theology? For the rest of this explainer, we're going to put on our impartial reporter hats and unpack how the author of our source material, Mark Bates, synthesizes these hard facts with specific theological frameworks.
Let's dive into Section 4, the author's synthesis, the divine promise plan.
Bates argues that these rock-solid secular facts serve as the crucial space-time anchor for a progressive theological framework. To bridge that gap between secular Roman records and Christian theology, the author points to the Apostle Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, specifically chapter 15. Now, the source highlights that critical scholars generally agree this text contains an oral creed dating to within just 1 to 3 years of the crucifixion. Bates uses this incredibly early eyewitness creed to argue that the theological claims about Jesus were immediate. They were right there from the start. They were definitely not legends that just sort of evolved centuries later. According to the source, this bridges directly into what theologian Walter C. Kaiser Jr. calls the promise plan framework. The author traces how this plan unfolds step by step. Step 1, the initial promise in Genesis regarding the seed. Step 2, the Abrahamic covenant promising a universal blessing. Step 3, the Davidic covenant promising an everlasting throne. And finally, Step 4, the new covenant realization in Messiah Jesus. The source argues that the verifiable history we just spent time reviewing acts as the concrete, real-world fulfillment of this exact theological trajectory. And all of this leads right to the author's primary conclusion. Because the execution of Jesus is a verifiable space-time fact, confirmed, as we saw, by hostile Roman and Jewish sources, the surrounding theology simply cannot be reduced to mere allegory or myth. It happened in history. Bates emphasizes that this historical anchor ensures a non-supersessionist fidelity. And basically, in his view, that just means the concrete promises made to ethnic Israel and the nations remain totally intact and historically grounded. Okay, let's wrap up today's explainer with one final, provocative thought for you to chew on. If the ancient, hostile, and secular sources all uniformly agree on the historical reality of Jesus of Nazareth, how does that change the way you read the narrative today? Whether you're approaching this as an ancient historian, a theologian, or honestly, just a curious learner, the historical footprint is undeniably massive. It is an open invitation to explore the data for yourself. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking great questions.